We usually don't think of serial killers as coming from rich and powerful families. We associate them with poor and middle-class families that lack power or authority over others. Often it is this need to obtain and hold power over others that leads them to kill and kill again. But what if our serial killer isn't from the modern era? What if our serial killer is a member of the upper classes, with important political connections and great wealth? What if our serial killer grew up in a time when the life of the lower classes was cheap, and it wasn't unusual for a member of the upper classes to beat or murder them without worry of retribution? What if our serial killer is a woman, the most powerful woman in her country, a countess, with dominion over thousands of peasants? The lower classes are powerless to stop her. The upper classes are afraid of her vast wealth and connections, and everyone is afraid to even mention what they suspect she is doing. How do you stop a serial killer like that? Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the Podcast of Doom, the podcast devoted to epic failure analysis. My name is David Appleson. Today we will venture out of the realm of natural and man-made disasters and examine the life of a female serial killer. But not just any female serial killer, history's most prolific serial killer. Her name is Elizabeth Bathory, but you may have also heard of her as the Blood Countess or Countess Dracula. She is credited with killing more than 600 people, almost all of whom were young women, mostly peasant girls, but later ladies of the lower gentry. She wasn't just any member of the nobility. She was the wealthiest and most powerful woman in Hungary. She owned and maintained several castles and ruled over the tenant farmers of all her lands. She wielded incredible power, and she took a perverse pleasure in using that power to inflict pain and suffering on others. Class warfare. It is something we hear a lot about these days. Politicians use the term a lot. The rich have it in for the poor. Poor, lazy people who live off the hard work of the wealthy. There's a lot of talk about who is conducting class warfare. You don't hear many people proudly say, "I'm leading a war on class. Who wants to follow me?" It is always something you accuse someone else of doing. But what if we are talking about Central Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries? Feudal times with distinct lines between the nobility and the peasant classes. Back then it was very clear who could do what to whom. A nobleman, particularly a well-connected nobleman, could do pretty much as he liked with the peasants on his properties. There were no police force or law system that protected the poor in feudal Europe, but there was still a certain sense of decency among the nobility about how they treated their peasants. And certain imaginary lines could be crossed. Today's episode will examine a woman who crossed one of those lines. She killed hundreds of young peasant women with impunity, because she was too rich and too powerful for just about anyone to stop her. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, Countess Elizabeth Bathory. The story of who Elizabeth Bathory was and why she did the things that she did requires a bit of detective work. We're talking about the late 16th and early 17th century in a part of the world that was undergoing a lot of turmoil. There was war with the Turks and war between the Protestants and Catholics during the period of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation that followed. She was a member of the upper nobility and one of the most powerful women in Eastern Europe. Most of her victims were of the peasant class, and their families had very good reasons for not speaking out against her. She was a Hungarian, and her victims were Slovakians at a time when the Hungarians ruled over the Slovaks. Although Elizabeth was never put on trial, her accomplices were. We can't say the defendant's testimony was completely reliable, as the courts of the time had very persuasive methods for extracting the truth they wanted to hear. But during those trials, the testimony of more than 300 witnesses was heard, including the peasants and members of the lower gentry, an almost unheard of thoroughness for the time. It is said that history is written by the victors, but it is also written by their survivors and the generations that follow them. That makes it all the more difficult to tell fact from fiction. Through all these distortions, I will attempt to convey her story as accurately as possible. Elizabeth Bathory, or Erzsébet Bathory, was born in 1560 or 61 in the Hungarian village of near Bátor, and grew up in said castle. Her father was George Bathory, a well-established baron from a well-established line of nobility. Her mother, Anna, was baroness. George and Anna came from different lines of the same family. As the nobility were looking for guarantees of pure lineage, they often married within the family. Her cousin was Stephen Bathory, the Prince of Transylvania. Yes, it was a real country, and later the King of Poland. Her uncle had also been the Prince of Transylvania. Her grandfather had once fought alongside Vlad Tepes, also known as Vlad the Impaler, possible inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula novel. She grew up in a time when much of Hungary had been overrun by the Turkish forces of the Ottoman Empire, and Hungary had become a battleground between the ambitions of the Ottoman Sultan and those of the mighty Habsburg family, who ruled Austria and much of Central Europe. Her family had vowed to protect Christian Europe from Turkish Muslim aggression. Hungary was also split by religious differences. In the battles following the Reformation, the Bathories had sided with the Protestant princes and against the Catholic Church. Elizabeth was raised a Protestant, but part of her education included the teachings of a Catholic monk. As a member of the upper nobility, she learned to speak Latin, German, and Greek fluently, in addition to her native Hungarian. It is reported that the young Elizabeth suffered from seizures accompanied by loss of control and fits of rage, which may have been caused by epilepsy. It is difficult to say to what degree inbreeding may have contributed to her mental state. Swift and brutal justice was common in her era. One anecdote tells of an incident she witnessed in which a local gypsy was accused and apprehended for theft by her father. The man was sewn up in the belly of a dying horse by the castle guards, with only his head exposed, and left to die. Elizabeth was engaged to Count Ferenc Naudoje at age 12. It was a politically arranged marriage between the two pairs of parents. Ferenc was the son of a Hungarian nobleman of incredible wealth. 2 years after the engagement, Elizabeth, at 13 years old, became pregnant by one of the servants at Ferenc's castle. During her pregnancy, she was kept locked up in the castle. When she gave birth to a daughter, the child was secretly spirited away and sent to be raised by a peasant family. Although Ferenc was not more than 18 years old, he delivered a blunt punishment to the young man. Ferenc had him castrated and immediately afterwards thrown to a pack of dogs. The couple was married in 1575. He was 19 and she was 14. It is said that more than 4,500 guests attended the wedding. Following tradition, Elizabeth moved into her new husband's castle in Shavar. While Ferenc studied in Vienna, Elizabeth spent much time alone in the castle. Ferenc's wedding gift to Elizabeth was the castle Choctetse. The castle had been bought by his mother in 1579 and given to Ferenc, who transferred it to Elizabeth during their nuptials. In 1578, Ferenc became the chief commander of the Hungarian troops, leading them to war against the Ottomans in the Long War, which saw Hungary as the main battleground between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. His duty as chief commander kept him away from their home at Shavar for years at a time. With her husband absent, Elizabeth managed business affairs and the couple's estates. She was also charged with the defense of her husband's lands, which lay on the route to Vienna. It was an awesome responsibility because the castle was very close to the border which separated Hungary from the Ottoman territories. By all accounts, she was an excellent administrator. There were several instances where she intervened on behalf of destitute women, including a woman whose husband was captured by the Turks and a woman whose daughter was raped and impregnated. During the times that Ferenc was not away at war, he and Elizabeth were able to raise a large family. Around 1585, 10 years after they married, she gave birth to a daughter, Anna. That was followed by the births of 2 more daughters, Ursula and Katharina, as well as a son named Paul. As a commander, Count Naudoje was known for great courage in battle and also for his extreme cruelty to Ottoman prisoners. Like his Wallachian predecessor, Vlad the Impaler, he learned the brutal practice and public display of impalement from his Ottoman enemies. While he was at war, the Countess kept order in the castle and commenced a regime of strict discipline and punishment of the servants. Elizabeth taught Ferenc various torture techniques to be applied to the servitude of the manor. Testimony from Elizabeth's servant later revealed that she was more skilled in the art of torture and began exchanging tips and tactics with her husband. Living in isolation and away from her husband, Elizabeth grew bored and restless. She decided to visit her aunt, Countess Clara Bathory. It is not exactly known what truly occurred during these visits, but rumors suggest that through the urging of her aunt, Elizabeth participated in orgies and sexual bondage practices. Elizabeth soon realized she had a taste for inflicting pain. It brought her great pleasure. She was also becoming infatuated with carnal pleasure and developing an interest in the occult. Soon thereafter, she became associated with Dorothea Sentesh, a black magic witch noted for her physical strength, who encouraged Elizabeth's sadistic tendencies and helped her refine acts and devices of torture. In 1604, Ferenc died suddenly of illness. It is uncertain what the exact cause of his death was, but his health had been deteriorating prior to his illness. Elizabeth inherited all of her husband's castles and lands, as well as a large debt owed to Ferenc by the King of Hungary for his service in the war. At the age of 44, Elizabeth transferred herself and her family to the royal court in Vienna, where she had an active social life. For reasons unknown, she soon retired to her castle at Chaktese, where she had more privacy. It was during her time at this castle that she took on as a servant and confidant the alleged witch Anna Darvulia. Some sources say that Darvulia may have even been her lover. Elizabeth also took into her employ some loyal servants. In addition to Dorothea Sentesh, there was Ilona Yonaji, her children's wet nurse, Katerina Beneski, another of the local peasantry, and Ioannis Warvari, also referred to as Fitzko, a teenage boy sometimes described as a dwarf-like cripple. This was the period in which Elizabeth is said to have committed her greatest atrocities, under the guidance of Darvulia. Pretty young women and children began to disappear from villages near the castle. Their families did not know what to do. Speaking out against the nobility could get them into trouble. Often they confided in their priests, but otherwise held their tongues in public. The peasants saw the Naudoji carriage, drawn by black horses, travel through their villages at night, with girls inside who never came back. This went on for several years. No one could challenge it. They had not forgotten that in 1524 the nobles had met a peasant uprising with extreme punishment, and no one was willing to risk that again. They quietly went about their business, believing it was their lot in life to endure whatever the lords and ladies meted out. Elizabeth and her accomplices would collectively torture and kill dozens of children, almost exclusively servant girls, between the ages of 10 and 14. It was easy to tempt poor young peasant women with promises of employment as seamstresses, washerwomen, and kitchen maids. Physically, young girls were easy targets for stronger older women and a young man to harass and restrain. All of the accomplices stated in their testimony that Anna Darvulia taught them how to torture and kill these children. And all agreed that the Countess took a barbed whip, cudgel, dagger, fire iron, needle, or cutting shears to them as well. In a time when cruel and arbitrary behavior by those in power toward those who were servants was common, Elizabeth's level of cruelty was noteworthy. She did not just punish infringements on her rules, but she found excuses to inflict punishments, and she seemed to take a certain delight in the torture and death of her victims far beyond what her contemporaries would accept. She would stick pins in various sensitive body parts, such as under the fingernails. In the winter, she would execute victims by a method known as death by water, by having them stripped, let out into the snow, and doused with water until they were caked with ice and they froze to death. Elizabeth was also petty and narcissistic. She changed her clothing 5 to 6 times a day and spent hours admiring her legendary beauty in mirrors. She used all manners of oils and unguents to preserve and whiten her skin. There was no one who could deny her whatever she wanted, and she demanded continuous praise. Her husband may have encouraged her cruel tendencies, but the testimonies indicate that plenty of her sadistic acts were of her own imagination. German anthropologist Michael Wegner points out that Elizabeth continued to use torture after her husband's death, and even refined her methods. The unhappy girls who were lured to the castle under the plea that they were to be taken into service there were locked up in a cellar. There they were beaten till their bodies were swollen. Elizabeth, not infrequently, tortured the victims herself. Often she changed their clothes, which dripped with blood, and then renewed her cruelties. The swollen bodies were often cut up with razors. Occasionally she had the girls burned and then cut up, but the great majority of them were beaten to death. Elizabeth's methods of torture evolved with time from simply biting and piercing servants who did not do their task properly to more intricate and elaborate methods of extracting personal pleasure. A few of the contraptions she used included the Iron Maiden, which was an iron cage in the shape of a woman, embedded with precious stones that would close upon its victim and pierce her with daggers located in the interior of the cage. Another torture involved the use of a cage lined with sharp blades that would be pulled up to the ceiling, piercing the victim's flesh as it swayed to and fro. Throughout these various episodes of torture and killing, Elizabeth would often talk and shout during the sessions and pace around as though she were a wild animal. It is at this time that legend says she discovered, on striking a servant girl who accidentally pulled her hair while combing it, that the blood spattered on her face appeared to reduce the signs of aging in her skin. The popular version of events tells how Elizabeth took to bathing in the blood of young girls. However, of all the various horrific eyewitness accounts of her crimes, none describe these bloodbaths. It is probably fable, introduced long after her death, but it is a fable which may have inspired Bram Stoker's work of fiction. In 1609, Anna Darvulia died, and Elizabeth seems to have taken up with a new accomplice, the widow of one of her tenant farmers named Erzai Marjarova, and it was perhaps at Erzai's instigation or encouragement that Elizabeth turned her hand against a number of girls from families of noble blood but little wealth, because it was thought that their blood was purer. More likely she had taken and executed so many of the local peasant girls that she was forced to move up the social ladder in order to obtain sufficient victims. She established a gynecium, or school of etiquette, where she promised the parents that she would teach their daughters courtly manners. Instead, she continued to satiate her sadistic appetite with more torture and killing. Reports were trickling into the royal court of relatives who died while at the gynecium. Others reported having seen traces of torture on dead bodies, some of which were buried in graveyards, and others in unmarked locations. However, 2 witnesses actually saw the Countess herself torture and kill young servant girls. According to the testimony of her accomplices, Bathory tortured and killed her victims not only at Chaktese, but also on her properties in Shavar, Bratislava, and Vienna, and at many points in between these locations. In addition to her accomplices, several people were named for supplying Elizabeth Bathory with young women. The girls had been procured either by deception or by force. Between 1602 and 1604, Lutheran minister Istvan Magyari complained about atrocities both publicly and with the court in Vienna, after rumors had spread. The Hungarian authorities took some time to respond to Magyari's complaints, but after the murder of a young noble lady in 1609, which Elizabeth tried to stage as a suicide, they finally decided to act. This suspicious incident, coupled with the many other rumors over the years, required action. King Matthias II supported it, because Elizabeth had been asking him to repay funds he owed to her husband, and if the rumors proved true and she was arrested, he would be free of his debt. In 1610, Matthias assigned Georgi Torzo, the Palatine of Hungary and Countess Bathory's cousin, to investigate. Torzo was the second most powerful man in Hungary next to the king himself. Torzo believed that 2 of Elizabeth's other cousins, Gabor and Sigmund, were stirring up a dangerous form of trouble that would ultimately threaten the interests of Hungarian landlords and nobles like himself. And Elizabeth made it clear that she supported her cousins against the king. So there was motivation on Torzo's part, whether personally or as a Palatine of Hungary, to curtail the power of the Bathory family in the interest of the nation. But Torzo was also a Bathory, and he moved quickly to save the family as much face as possible by effecting Elizabeth's capture on his own terms. On December 30th, 1610, he led soldiers in a night raid on Castle Chaktese. The investigative group moved quickly through the halls, searching for evidence against the Countess. Someone tipped over something in the dark, and when it was illuminated, they discovered it was the body of a young girl. The body appeared to be torn and cut. The men continued on, descending down 150 stairs into a damp dungeon, where they found an older woman crouched over a table, fiddling with some vials. It was Elizabeth. She was immediately taken into custody. One of Turzo's lieutenants wrote that as they searched the castle, they came upon the dead bodies of young girls everywhere they looked. Many had no arms or eyes. One blackened body was in the fireplace, not fully burned, and quite a few were buried in shallow graves around the castle. We watched in horror as the dogs ran about with parts of the girls in their mouths, he said. When the search was complete, it was reported that nearly 50 corpses were found under the castle, and a number of girls were imprisoned in dungeons with pierced holes in their bodies. Dorothea, Ilona Joe, and Fitzko were arrested, along with Katerina Beneski. Erze Majorova escaped capture in the raid, but was later also arrested. Elizabeth was held but not taken away with her associates. Torzo ordered 2 notaries to collect evidence. The notaries collected testimony from more than 300 witnesses. The trial records include the testimony of the 4 defendants. Priests, noblemen, and commoners were also questioned, as well as the other personnel of the castle. 21 judges were on hand on January 2, 1611, when the proceedings of the special tribunal began, with Judge Theodosius de Sulo of the Royal Supreme Court presiding. They called numerous witnesses, sometimes 35 a day, including the families from which girls had gone missing and the victims who had survived. They learned much from the surviving victims, as well as detailed stories from the crew of accomplices. Elizabeth was not present at the trial and was not asked to testify. Instead, she remained in her castle, maintaining her innocence. It is possible that her high-born relatives persuaded the court to keep her under house arrest and delay a sentence indefinitely. The principal testimony against Elizabeth was offered by her servants and by people who had assisted her in her bloody campaign. Each of her cohorts was asked the same 11 questions about how long he or she had been at the castle and what things had been done there related to the crimes. In particular, they were all asked whom they had murdered, how many, where the victims were from, and who had brought them to the castle. They were also pressed to describe any tortures they had used and what had happened to the bodies of the girls that died. More to the point, they were to describe fully the Countess's involvement. According to all testimony, her initial victims were the adolescent daughters of local peasants, many of whom were lured to Castle Chaktese by offers of well-paid work as maidservants. Later, she started killing daughters of the lesser gentry. Abductions occurred as well. The atrocities described most consistently included severe beatings, burning, or mutilation of hands, biting the flesh off of the faces, arms, and other body parts, freezing or starving to death, and the use of needles to inflict pain. In a separate trial, another servant named Zuzana gave evidence of the existence of a register in her mistress's handwriting, which recorded over 650 victims who had died at the Countess's hands over the years. This evidence was shaky, as the register itself was never actually produced. The following are examples of the testimony of the servants recorded at the trial of Elizabeth's accomplices. A 12-year-old girl named Paula somehow managed to escape from the castle, but Dorothea, aided by Ilana Jo, caught the frightened girl by surprise and brought her forcibly back to Chaktese. Clad only in a long white robe, Countess Elizabeth greeted the girl upon her return. The Countess was in another of her rages. She advanced on the 12-year-old girl and forced her into a kind of cage. This particular cage was built like a huge ball, too narrow to sit in, too low to stand in. Once the girl was inside, the cage was suddenly hauled up by a pulley, and dozens of short spikes jutted into the cage. Paula tried to avoid being caught on the spikes, but Fitzko maneuvered the ropes so that the cage shifted from side to side. Paula's flesh was torn to pieces. One accomplice testified that on some days Elizabeth had stark naked girls laid flat on the floor of her bedroom and tortured them so much that one could scoop up the blood by the pailful afterwards. And so Elizabeth had her servants bring up cinders in order to cover the pools of blood. A young maidservant who did not endure the tortures well and died very quickly was written out by the Countess in her diary with the comment, "She was too small." At one point in her life, Elizabeth Bathory was so sick that she could not move from her bed and could not find the strength to torture her miscreant servant girls. She demanded that one of her female servants be brought before her. Dorothea Sentesh dragged one of Elizabeth's girls to her bedside and held her there. Elizabeth rose up on her bed, and like a bulldog, the Countess opened her mouth and bit the girl first on the cheek. Then she went for the girl's shoulders, where she ripped out a piece of flesh with her teeth. After that, Elizabeth proceeded to bite the girl's breasts. The exact number of young women tortured and killed by Elizabeth Bathory is unknown, though it is often speculated to be as high as 650 between the years 1585 and 1610. The estimates differ greatly. During the trial and before their execution, Sentesh and Fitzko reported 36 and 37 respectively during their periods of service. The other defendants estimated a number of 50 or higher. Many Shavar Castle personnel estimated the number of bodies removed from that castle at between 100 to 200. Ilona Jo and Dorothea Sentesh were named as the foremost perpetrators and sentenced as witches to have the fingers which had dipped in the blood of Christians torn out with red-hot pincers, and then to be burned alive. As a lesser offender, Fitzko was decapitated before his body was burned alongside the two women. On January 24th, Erzai Majarova was also sentenced and executed. Of those tried, only Katerina Benseki escaped the death sentence, exonerated by her fellow defendants. Elizabeth Bathory was never brought to trial, and therefore she was convicted of no crime. However, when she attempted to flee, Torzo had her confined to the castle at Chaktese. Her family stubbornly refused the king's demands that she be tried for her crimes. While he was probably shocked by the extent of the countess's deeds, the king's desire for justice was almost certainly in part due to the large debt incurred against Ferenc. Elizabeth's conviction would have allowed the king to not only write off that debt, but also to seize the Nodaji lands, and those held by Elizabeth as a Bathory. Consequently, the Bathorys must have brought all of their considerable influence to bear to keep that from happening. In the end, Elizabeth Bathory was imprisoned for life, with no formal sentencing. A stonemason was hired to brick her into a small set of rooms in her own castle at Chaktese, with only small slits left open for ventilation and the passing of meals. Her son and sole heir wrote a letter on her behalf asking for mercy, but her daughter Anna vowed never to speak to her again. Elizabeth claimed that she was innocent of all charges to the end. She said the peasant girls died of many different things, from contagious disease to blood poisoning, and she should not be held responsible for the whims of nature. She was kept a prisoner in her own castle for 4 years. On August 24th, 1614, Elizabeth Bathory was found dead, lying face down in her room by a guard looking in through one of the slots. Since there were several plates of food untouched, her actual date of death is unknown. She was buried in the church of Chaktese, but due to the villagers' uproar over having the tigress of Chaktese buried in their cemetery, her body was moved to her birth home at Exed, where it is interred at the Bathory family crypt. So what goes on in the mind of a serial killer such as Elizabeth Bathory? I'm fortunate to have as a guest on the podcast of Doom, Mark Hewitt, editor of Radians and Inches, the blog devoted to the Zodiac Killer and other serial killers. Okay, I want to welcome Mark Hewitt to the show. Mark is the editor of the online, scholarly, peer-reviewed journal dedicated to the search for the Zodiac Killer. I have asked Mark to join us for this episode to help us gain a better understanding of how the mind of a serial killer such as Elizabeth Bathory works. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I'd like to get started. I've given you I little bit of background on Elizabeth Bathory. I I found that after I was researching her case that I immediately realized that she had almost absolute power over the peasant girls on her lands, and that the upper gentry were pretty much untouchable, and the peasants basically had no rights, and that it was not uncommon at all at that time for a member of the nobility to beat, torture, or kill one of their peasants. So based on your knowledge, how important is this idea of perceived power to most serial killers?
It's very important, David. My research, I found that power is an influencing factor in the activities of the serial killer. Serial killers tend to have a feeling of powerlessness in some or all of parts of their lives, and therefore they respond to it by taking power over other people. A serial killer has a tendency to get mixed up between violence and sex, and they go out and kill people and enact violence in different ways to feel power over the people that they are abusing. And of course, the ultimate power is that of being able to have life and death decision over somebody and be able to actually take their lives.
Yeah, that's what I seem to notice with Elizabeth Bathory, is that she enjoyed seeing the fear in other people. It was something that she particularly wanted to get a reaction out of. And do you find that's true with the other serial killers, is that they get a real pleasure out of seeing people in fear?
It depends the type. Some serial killers believe in you get the most gratification simply out of killing and getting away. And so no thought or no concern is put into the victim's reaction. Others, however, actually get off on seeing fear and terror in the eyes of their victims. These would be the sadistic serial killers. And sadistic serial killers are one of the most rare types of serial killers, thankfully. They enjoy inflicting pain on others, and they will frequently torture victims for hours. They will even torture a victim until they are at the point of death, and then revive them so that they can torture them some more. By the end of the ordeal, the victims are frequently pleading for their lives.
And that sounds a lot like what Elizabeth Bathory did, though we don't have exact details of how they went, but the fact that the torture sessions were very long and drawn out, and that she did seem to take that pleasure in just taking them right up to the point of them asking for absolute mercy. Could you name a couple of the serial killers that you know that are known as sadists?
There was a team of sadistic serial killers, Blake and Ing, who operated in Washington State. They were, one of them was from Canada, and so they were instrumental in capturing women, keeping them in a basement area that they had built, and then torturing them for hours before finally killing them. And let me add, David, that not only do these victims plead for their lives, but by the end of the torturing, they're actually pleading to be put to death so that they won't have to feel the suffering that they've gone through anymore.
Yes, I can totally understand that, and I'm certain that was what must have been going on with Elizabeth Bathory. Mark, I'm glad that you brought up Blake and Ing, and that I was going to ask you about accomplices, because I don't hear that too much with serial killers, but with Elizabeth Bathory, of course, she was in a position of power and wealth, so she was in a position where she could take on accomplices. But I was wondering today, with in this century with serial killers, do you find that some of them or a lot of them have accomplices, or are they pretty much loners?
Willing accomplices do exist, but more common are the individual serial killers, the ones that we're familiar with, that get the most press, like Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy and Dennis Rader and BTK. These are all individuals, and almost certainly the Zodiac was as well. Individuals who do not work well with others and are simply out there killing people by themselves. But two people working together do happen. Blake and Ing are just one example. The Hillside Stranglers are another. Los Angeles in the 1970s. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka up in Canada, in the Toronto area, were teams as well. When you have a two-person team of serial killers, frequently there's one dominant individual and one that is submissive. With Elizabeth Bathory, it's a little bit difficult to know the individual motivations of anyone involved with her killing. It could be that simply because she had so much power that she was paying people to do what she wanted them to do, for breathing threats if individuals did not cooperate with her. But it's entirely possible that one or more individuals participated for their own personal gratification. But you really have to study those individuals to understand what their prime motivation was for participating.
And that's an excellent point, Mark. And it's difficult to tell because so much time has passed, but also because the testimony that the defendants, in other words, the accomplices, gave, we kind of have to weigh that a bit because they had their own reasons for trying to portray their own narrative in their testimony. She was also a remarkably intelligent woman for her time. She was fluent in Greek, Latin, German, and Hungarian, and that was unusual for a woman during that century to be as highly educated as she was. So according to your research, would you say that most serial killers have above average intelligence?
Much of the research done has pointed out that serial killers come from every strata of society. In fact, if you try to say something about a serial killer or impose a rule upon them, you will invariably find an exception to the rule. Mm-hmm. Within society today, there are male and female serial killers, female, of course, being much rarer. There are intelligent serial killers like Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, as well as unintelligent serial killers like David Carpenter, Jeffrey Dahmer, and many others that we've never heard of. But serial killers can come from Asia, they can be African American, Latino, Russian, European. Serial killers can be straight, gay, bisexual. They're really a diversified group. It's hard to pin down exactly what they are. In fact, it seems that they're more of a sociological phenomenon than a psychological phenomenon.
Now, towards the end, is just before she gets caught, I described it as being a little bit sloppy, but I think towards the end she wasn't so guarded in what she did, or she was not watching out after her accomplices very well, because they had so many bodies that they were running out of places to dispose of them, and they ended up some of the bodies ended up out in the open, and animals were actually getting to the bodies and taking off with some of the body parts. So not the best way to conceal evidence. And then the second thing was she also stops abducting peasant girls and starts abducting members of the lower gentry. So that would be like the nobility, who are limited in their wealth and in their power, but still considered the nobility. And once she started doing that, that was really when she set herself up to get caught, because those people could complain to the king, and that's exactly what they did. So, and I'm wondering, in comparing her to other serial killers, do you find that as they get closer to that point of getting caught, do they start making some mistakes?
That is a very common phenomenon. And there are two reasons for that. First is an overconfidence. If they've been getting away with murder with impunity for year after year, time after time, they start to believe in their own invincibility, and they will let their guard down and start taking more chances. A second reason is that they actually start to psychologically disintegrate often. An individual who's involved in killing other people knows that it's wrong and knows that society is against them. They will start to unravel and start feeling more, not necessarily remorse, but some type of psychological breakdown will frequently occur. And we saw that with Paul Bernardo and Jeffrey Dahmer, who each began drinking very heavily as their criminal careers progressed. And it made them much easier to get caught. In fact, Jeffrey Dahmer, it was because of his drinking that he did get caught. And I understand Ted Bundy became psychologically, he started to unravel as well, and he became less cautious about selecting his victims and concealing the remains once he had killed somebody, and actually went on sprees where he killed a bunch of college students and just in a tirade. Interestingly, a lot of serial killers expect to get caught after their first murder. They know what they've done is wrong, and they just assume that everybody is after them. So they frequently go home and wait for the phone call or wait for the knock on the door from the police because they know they've done something wrong and they know they're going to get caught. But as the days go by and they realize they got away with it, suddenly they begin to believe in their own power and believe in their own intelligence and think that they're smarter than the police, and that propels them to continue on and even take more chances as time progresses.
That's an interesting point. Now, I hadn't really considered that the cumulative weight of the murders on their consciences would start to weigh on them. As I was thinking that more, I was thinking along the lines that they might have gotten tired of killing people after so long without getting caught. But I mean, that's an interesting point, and I'm sure to a certain extent it probably did catch up with Elizabeth Bathory, the toll it must have taken on her.
Yeah, and it's a similar situation to John Wayne Gacy, who buried victims underneath his house. With all of the victims that he was taking, he literally ran out of space in his basement and his crawl space, and ended up having to go to other locations to bury bodies. Just the sheer number of victims can overwhelm a serial killer at times.
Have you, in your research, have you encountered any other serial killers that were quite as prolific as Elizabeth, maybe up into the hundreds?
Well, I have not. I tend to deal with a very specific group of serial killers, ones who are the lust killers, mainly working by themselves. Therefore, they're frequently caught. 650 is an incredible number. Contributing to her huge number of victims was the fact that she did have so much power and apparently so much money that she could buy off or threaten off anybody who would have a problem with what she was doing. But as far as numbers go, that's extremely high for a serial killer.
That was my understanding, and I agree with you that I think she was in a really unusual position in which she could do that, because exactly, she did have the power, she did have the connections, and she had access to a ready supply of victims whose families were not going to speak out against her. So I think if you compare that to modern times, it would be highly unusual to find somebody in that kind of a position.
A comparable serial killer might be Gary Ridgway, the Green River killer, who was successful because he took prostitutes who tended to move from city to city and tended not to be very important in the lives of many people. So he was able to, I believe, charged with 49, but the actual number was probably in the 80s. And he was able to get away with it because he was dealing with people who weren't as valuable within a society. Prostitute murders tend to last longer as serial killers.
And would you describe him as an opportunist? In other words, was he particularly seeking out prostitutes for that reason?
Oh, absolutely. He was wily enough to know that he could kill a prostitute and get away with it, where if he took a neighbor or somebody known to him or some prominent member of society, he wouldn't have lasted very long.
You had brought up the point about how power can sometimes go to a serial killer's head, and I was wondering, since your area of specialty is the Zodiac killer, did anything like that happen to the Zodiac killer? Is it noticeable at some point that he's really thinks so highly of himself that he would never get caught?
Oh yeah, and that comes through in a number of the letters that the Zodiac sent to the police and the press. Serial killers in general have have a relationship with other people where they attempt to dominate them, manipulate them, and control them. They are generally sociopathic, which means they have no conscience. They don't feel like they've done anything wrong. They tend to have a grandiose view of themselves, of how important they are, and they tend to have a feeling of entitlement, where they can do whatever they want, and it's nobody else's business. So because of these attitudes, other people have no more intrinsic value than, say, a lamp. So a serial killer will look at another human being just to find out, just to see what they can get from them. There's no relationship there. There's nothing of importance there. It's just something to use and abuse.
Emphasis of my podcast is finding where the failure happened and what went wrong. And in my analysis, what I've seen is this is a case of, does absolute power corrupt absolutely? And I was wondering, just from what you've read and what I've told you, does that sound like kind of what went wrong with Elizabeth Bathory, why she became the serial killer, and something in her psyche wanted to take advantage of that power?
I suspect not, but again, it's just a suspicion, because I think the power that she was able to attain contributed to her ability to get away with what she was doing and to not get caught. But I believe that it was within her to do what it is that she did. I don't believe that it was the obtaining of power that made her do it. An example I think of is Nelson Mandela. If anybody had something close to absolute authority, absolute power, when he came to power in South Africa after being released from prison, he had the power to do anything and be anything, and yet he made the choice to work toward reconciliation and to build a better country and to improve the lives of other people rather than enrich himself. And so I think he's an excellent example of somebody who can gain power and use it for the right purposes, whereas obviously Elizabeth Bathory used what authority and power she had to do horrible, horrible things.
Well, that's a pretty amazing contrast. I think that's an excellent point that you bring up. Two completely different people in similar positions that went two completely different directions with what they did with the power that was available to them. Just last question is there any point of failure that you saw here? Was there anything that anyone at the time could have done to have stopped Elizabeth from torturing and killing all these people? Or is this just one of these lessons of history that just might happen again?
Well, I suspect that there were certain childhood problems, childhood experiences that plagued her. What exactly they were, we may never know. There may have been people in her past who, in her childhood or in early years, who may have seen something and been in a position to make a difference. Obviously, they did not act. What exactly motivated her, what exactly motivates any serial killer is hard to say. We're still in infancy in studying these individuals to find out what makes them tick and why they do what they do, the choices they make. Obviously, they're fully responsible for what it is that they did. But how we can recognize these individuals is another story altogether. I suspect that there were people close to her who, for whatever reason, went along with what it was that she was doing, probably because of power or money or maybe their own participation in the events. But and any of these people could have come forward and said what we're doing or what's taking place is wrong and we need to intervene. So I would say there was a failure of intervention in numerous places in the life of her.
I think that's an excellent point, Mark, and I really hadn't even looked at it that way, but the idea of failure of intervention is an excellent one, because I think there were a number of people that could have done something, but for whatever various reasons they all decided to go along with it. Excellent point. I thank you for taking the time out to join us. I think you've brought a lot of nuance to this subject, and hopefully for the listening audience, a greater appreciation.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for joining me for the Podcast of Doom. Please feel free to comment regarding your thoughts by emailing me at podcastofdoompod@gmail.com or visit me at www.thepodcastofdoom.com. And while you're there, please send me a message. I'd love to hear from you and answer any questions you may have. You can even suggest future episodes. Also, I encourage you to check out Mark Hewitt's website devoted to the Zodiac Killer. You can find that at radiansandinches.com. Until next time, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.